I'd like to introduce our very first speaker. Her name is Dr. Carolina Fernandez Quintanilla, and I'm going to read for every one of our speakers a quick bio to introduce them, and then they will begin their half an hour time. So Dr. Carolina Fernandez Quintanilla is currently a lecturer in English language, linguistics, and stylistics in the School of Arts, English, and Languages at Queen's University Belfast. Her area of specialism is stylistics or literary linguistics. Her main research interests are narrative and narrative analysis, reader response, especially empathy with characters, and empirical methods. This is Dr. Carolina with the role of narrative and language to facilitate understanding an empirical reader response study on narrative empathy.
Hello, I guess everyone can see me now. I hope that. Anyway, can everyone hear okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Perfect.
Thanks, Carolina.
Okay, so thanks for giving me the chance to be part of this really interesting conference. And what I'm presenting today comes from my PhD thesis, which I finished a couple of years ago. And I'm still presenting on this work before moving on to a new project. And I'm working in the discipline of linguistics, and I hope you find this presentation interesting. The title of my talk is The Role of Narrative and Language to Facilitate Understanding, an empirical reader response study on narrative empathy. So the motivation was to investigate narrative empathy, which is empathy with characters in narrative texts. And in simple terms, narrative empathy is about sharing characters' perspectives and mental states while you read. Okay, so you look at the story world from the point of view of the characters and you kind of feel what they are feeling. So the study was empirical because I collected data from real readers, and I approached real readers because in my discipline, scholars have made a series of claims about the potential of narrative techniques to make readers empathize with characters. So for example, one hypothesis is that when you have a first-person narrator, you will automatically, or you will be very likely to empathize with the character narrator. But I wasn't fully convinced by this, and I said, the things might be more complex than that, so let's investigate. So there were all these claims and hypotheses in the literature, and I wanted to see what happened with actual readers. Am I sharing my screen? I will share it now. Right. Okay. I hope that's that you can see that now.
It doesn't look like we can see your screen yet. I'm wondering if Morgan needs to come in and do something on her end real fast.
Okay.
Do you have access to that green share screen button, Carolina?
Yeah, I just press it. Ah, wait, desktop one.
Perfect. We can see it now. That's great.
Yeah. Right. Okay, perfect. So here are the aims of my paper today. To reflect on the role of narrative and language to facilitate understanding in situations of conflict and violence. So this is the connection I want to make between my study and the topic of the conference. Then to consider how narrative can trigger empathy or otherwise in response to stories that portray human conflicts and suffering within contexts of political struggle. Since the conference is interested in storytelling and narrative of violence, very conveniently, the stories that I analyzed and that participants read involve characters in situations of political conflicts. Okay, I will touch on the theme of the stories later on. And finally, to contribute to our understanding of processes around communication and empathy from a linguistic point of view. So a fundamental principle in linguistics and narrative studies is that the way we tell stories matters a lot. and this can influence how we respond to stories. So today I hope to show that the ways in which stories are constructed and the specific choices that authors make can affect how we understand characters and how we engage with them. In this case, how we empathize or fail to empathize with both perpetrators and victims of violence. Okay, so here's an outline of my talk. First, I will give you some background information about the study. Then I will discuss the concept of narrative empathy. After that, I will mention the factors that can be potentially involved in narrative empathy. And to keep it relevant to the topic of the conference, I will especially focus on the role of identity in our responses to characters. And finally, I will move on to my findings, and I will mainly focus on the ways in which participants related to characters on the basis of perceptions of difference and similarity. So my research involved an empirical stylistic reader response study of narrative empathy, and I will unpack this for you. Stylistics is a discipline at the interface of linguistics and literary studies. So we analyze the language of texts in order to explain their effects on readers. For example, we look at things like how is point of view constructed in a story, and how does that affect the way that we position ourselves in relation to characters. So as I said earlier, this study was empirical, meaning that I conducted discussions with real readers to find out how they actually reacted to the narrative texts and the characters. The study was fully qualitative. I analyzed 3 short stories in depth and then conducted 2 focus groups with 9 readers. So I had 5 participants in a group, 4 participants in the other. The participants were Spanish speakers because the stories were originally written in Spanish. I didn't want any translation issues to get in the way. Then participants read the stories and then they shared their experiences with the characters. Okay, my data was made up of short stories written by Eduardo Galeano. He was born in Uruguay in 1940. He was a journalist, an editor of several newspapers, and because of his political ideas, he was in exile from both the Uruguayan dictatorship and the Argentinian dictatorship in the 70s and the 80s. His literary work is socially committed, and pretty much in every text that he has written, there is protest and resistance to all kinds of oppression and power abuse. For example, colonialism and the post-colonial situation in Latin America, or the economic exploitation and political dominance of Europe and the United States over Latin America. His work is truly, truly fascinating. So I recommend reading some of it because there are excellent translations into English. And then here are the 3 stories that were analyzed and that readers discussed in the focus groups. So the point of this slide is that to show you how short the stories were, which was very practical. So the stories were taken from the Book of Embraces. These are 3, all the stories in that book are biographical and have a non-fictional status because they are based on actual historical events. The stories portray experiences of violence and conflicts during the Uruguayan dictatorship from 1973 to 1985, the Argentinian dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, and the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. My English gets a bit funny. I've been speaking Spanish for 2 months since the lockdown. Right, so then moving on to my research topic, what is narrative empathy then? It's one of the different psychological processes that we experience when we read and also when we watch a film or a play, right? So it happens across media. And it is one of the ways in which we engage with characters. So both lay people and scholars talk about our engagement with characters in terms of identification, or we use metaphors such as feeling close to the character or putting ourselves in the shoes of the character. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these expressions. Okay, so these expressions can be really useful to express how we relate to characters. But what do we actually mean when we say that we empathize with characters? Narrative empathy can be defined, as you can read on the slides, as understanding and coming to share characters' perspective and mental states. Okay, so you look at things from characters' point of view and come to experience what you think they are experiencing. When we empathize, we simulate characters' mental states, and I use this term broadly to include emotions, thoughts, beliefs, values, intentions, and desires. Importantly, narrative empathy involves mentally simulating characters' experiences from their perspective, taking into account their context. So here scholars make a crucial distinction between self-oriented perspective taking and other-oriented perspective taking. Self-oriented perspective taking is about considering what it would be like for me to be in the situation of the character, okay? So how would I feel? What would I do if I were in the position of the character? In contrast, other-oriented perspective taken is about experiencing what it must be like for the character to be in their situation. So in my study, I consider other-oriented empathy. That's what I want to focus on. And here the focus is on what it must be like for the character to be experiencing the situation from their perspective. Okay, and finally, it's worth mentioning that empathy is closely related to other psychological phenomena, but it's different from them. For example, sympathy, when you feel sorry for someone. Okay, now, there are a range of factors that may influence narrative empathy, both textual and non-textual. Non-textual meaning factors to do with us as readers, human beings who engage with the text. So the textual factors that I explored were point of view, from whose perspective do we see things in the story, discourse presentation, which is about the ways in which characters' speech and thought are presented in the story, emotion presentation, or the way in which characters' emotions are communicated to the reader, and finally characterization techniques, which involve a huge range of aspects, such as naming, actions, personal attributes, or how characters relate to one another, to other characters in the story world. And then I examined other factors to do with readers. So they are the non-textual ones. For example, contextual appraisal is about how we evaluate the context that characters find themselves in. And this includes moral evaluation, right? Perceptions of right and wrong, good and evil. Our moral positioning is an important factor that determines how we relate to characters and also people in the real world, as you know very well. Finally, I looked at group identity, which I explain on the next couple of slides. Okay, and I thought this factor would be relevant given the topic of the conference. Okay, so on the next slide, we can see that especially salient in scholarly discussions is the role of group identity in the elicitation of empathy. And here are some specific claims. Many scholars agree that narrative empathy can be influenced by our perceived relationship with the character. And then these two neuroscientists, Tanya Singer and Klaus Lamm, argue that our attitudes towards the target of empathy can affect our empathetic responses. Then we have literary scholar Susan Kim, who suggests that for most people, perceived similarity encourages empathy. And then a few more claims. Douglas Holland from Cultural Studies argues that empathy is thought to be more often directed at members of the in-group, however defined, that's crucial, while it is usually withheld from members of the out-group. Oh, sorry. Then we have Franz de Waal, a primatologist. He concludes that empathy builds on proximity, similarity, and familiarity. So his point is that empathy thrives when encountering those who have been pre-approved based on similarity and closeness. And he believes that empathy evolved to promote in-group cooperation. Now, in more specific terms, what is involved in this similarity, right? Tony Sanford, who was a cognitive psychologist, and Cathy Emmott, a linguist, proposed that empathy can be facilitated by autobiographical alignment. That is, when readers and characters share autobiographical characteristics, such as age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. But also if readers have already experienced events and circumstances that the characters are undergoing. Okay, so far so good, that's what the literature says, but all of this comes with a huge caveats. Even if interpersonal similarity and autobiographical alignments might facilitate empathy, scholars agree that they are not strictly necessary for empathy to take place. Okay, so that's what the literature says, and now I move on to my findings. The key finding from my study is that empathy tends to happen when information about character situation and internal states is made available in the story. So participants reported empathy with characters when the text allows access to the character's situation and mental states, that is, their emotions, their thoughts, desires, etc. For my discipline, this is an important finding because the specific narrative technique by which this is achieved doesn't matter much, okay? And the absolute key is that the information about character, situation, and experiences is conveyed and made available. But again, there is a caveat. A negative moral evaluation can override the potential of the text to elicit empathy. So the moment the reader rejects the character for moral reasons, empathy can be switched off. For the remainder of the time, I will illustrate this with one of the stories and participants' responses to it. Okay, so professional life is one of the stories. This is based on the torture suffered by Lucien Amadou Berat, who fought in the National Liberation Front against France during the Algerian War of Independence. The story focuses on the unnamed civil servant, the torturer or the French official, who tortured Amadou day after day for several months. So thankfully, this person survived the torture, and he told Galeano, the author of the stories, about his experiences. And what is interesting is that the main focus of this story is on the torturer himself, rather than on the victim. So I will tell you about how my participants reacted to this character, to the torturer. So I will be discussing empathy with the perpetrator of violence, which may be a more difficult empathy than empathizing with the victim of violence. Okay. So the readers who had negative moral evaluations about the torturer did not empathize with him. They blamed the character, they judged his behavior to be morally wrong, and evaluated the character, and I quote, as inhumane, lacking moral values, a sociopath, cruel, and evil, and also a sadist. So this finding is in line with what empathy researchers say in neuroscience and philosophy, that a negative moral evaluation, negative moral appraisal, including the allocation of blame, can override any empathy. So I guess that's what you would expect, right? Someone torturing human beings is not likely to get a lot of understanding. However, something surprising happened in the discussions. So the majority of readers, 6 out of 9, reported empathizing with the torturer. And some of you might be thinking, how would anyone be able to understand and empathize with a torturer, right? So in my thesis, I argued that empathy with a torturer was possible due to the way the story is told, with a very strong focus on the torturer's point of view, his emotions, and his thoughts. But also the other key factor was readers' perceptions of similarity. So here I will show you. My analysis shows that these 6 participants were able to empathize with a morally unacceptable character on the basis of perceptions of similarity. On the slide, you can see the 2 main themes in the discussions. So first, the participants who empathize with the torturer attributed to him certain goals and values that made them understand his situation, and they put the blame in his context rather than in the character himself. So they thought that the torturer's situation forces him to do his job. And let's see some examples on the next slide. I will summarize this for you because I'm aware of time. Participants thought that his situation forces him to do this torturer job to survive. He needs to earn a salary to feed his family, his wife and his newborn baby. Then he has been raised in a colonial mindset as part of the French colonizers, and so he cannot look at it in any other way. Okay, so the most important point here is that none of the participants agreed with the practice of torturing, but crucially, none of them condemned the character morally, right? There was no negative moral evaluation towards him. Then the other theme in the discussions was that participants perceived plenty of similarity between the torturer's situation and the situation of people who are very close to participants. So again, I summarized what they discussed. Back in 2015, when the data was collected, Spain was facing a major economic crisis, as many other countries in the world. So participants could relate the experience of the torturer with the experience of people they knew very well, who had to put up with jobs they didn't want to do simply because they needed to feed their family, right? Feeding your family is the main thing. So I argue that this similarity of experience enabled them to empathize with the torturer, okay? And I'm curious to hear if this is surprising for you or what you think about this. Okay, so finally, to conclude, we still know very little about the complexity of experiences of empathy and narrative empathy. So plenty of research remains to be done. We have really only scratched the surface, really. Empathy seems to be influenced by interpersonal similarity and difference, as I have shown today. Empathy may be a choice in that we can choose to selectively understand others or not. I have shown this with examples from my data, where non-empathetic responses were largely based on moral assessments, right? So here I argue that the participants who did not empathize with the torturer perceived him to be part of their moral outgroup. And in contrast, most participants displayed empathy based on similarity of experience. So here you can argue that the participants who reported empathy with the torturer perceived him to be part of their experiential in-group, right? Then here are the sources I mentioned. And finally, here's my personal email address. My Queen's will expire in the summer. So in case, I leave you my email address here in case you want to discuss things or share sources or whatever you like. So thank you very much for listening.
That was so great, Carolina. Thank you so much. So I just have a couple of questions here for you. My first question for our Q&A is, you talked about how blame was the one factor that seemed to override empathy. Did you, in any of the reading, find any other factors that overrid empathy?
There are a range of factors, but because I only focused on those two, contextual appraisal, how we evaluate the context, including moral evaluation, and then our relationship and identity. I don't really remember, you know, when you finish, I finished it too long ago to remember.
I feel you there. I just finished an essay last night and I can barely remember.
Yeah. I know perspective is involved, whether you take their perspective or not. But you can give me the email address of the person and I can
Yeah, no
I
worries.
can read through my notes. Yeah.
Sounds great. Just one more question for you, and then I believe we're going to go into a short break before our next
Okay.
speaker. My next question is, did any of the storytellers define the term empathy within their works?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
You mean authors themselves?
Yeah. Did they at any time bring up the term empathy and describe what that meant to them, their own personal definition?
Mm, not, so you mean the literary author?
Yeah.
No, not in my case.
Okay. No
Not that I'm
worries.
aware of. You
Well,
know, the
thank
thing
you.
with empathy is that you can mean the same thing and use a different word because we
Mm-hmm.
use it all the time. So we might be meaning the same things and using different words.
Yeah,
But
that makes sense.
I'm not aware about that in the case of Eduardo Galeano.
Well, great. Thank you so much again
You?
for this great talk and great presentation.
Thank you.
And please write down her email if you have any questions, everybody, or enter them into the chat or the Q&A function. We may take those down for later. And right now we are going to take a short break, about 6 minutes, I would say. And we would begin with the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.